חידה באמצע הדרך, מאת דוקטור אלון גלעדי. על הבעיה הפסיכו-פיסית ופתרונה האמוני-לוגי.
The crown jewel of the formal thought of Leibowitz is embodied in the problem which he calls the psycho-physical problem. This problem discusses, in a seemingly philosophical-logical manner, the connection between the science to the morality and to the faith, and also the connection between the scientific facts to the subjective will of man, according to his system. This is a problem discussing the connection which was called throughout the generations as the relation between body and soul, which the formal Leibowitz claims that it is not to be found, or more precisely, is not given to the knowledge and to the understanding of man. The refutation of this claim of the formal Leibowitz will be discussed in this chapter, in which I will seek to illustrate by its means that which I showed in the previous chapter, meaning that in practice there is no essential difference between a scientific fact to a moral fact, both given to objective revelation, in addition to an additional fact more difficult for revelation than both of them, and it is the faithful logical fact. This refutation will be done from a logical perspective, and more than that, from a faithful logical perspective together. Within the framework of this refutation, I will refer of course also to its conclusions in relation to the problem of the free will in a world of logical faith, and I will show that the logical connection which the formal Leibowitz made, in the negative sense, between the body, the soul, and the free will, was erroneous in its basis.
הפרחה לוגית.
The psycho-physical problem, according to Leibowitz, is a problem which is between the public domain and the private domain, coming to show the difference between body and the soul of man. Leibowitz seeks to distinguish between the seemingly subjective will of man, deciding in an autonomous manner regarding his values and his faiths, between the physical world, which according to Leibowitz is not given to decision, which is an objective given to revelation only. To the claim of Leibowitz, we recognize a physical world, including things each of which is defined from the perspective of its location in space, and is given to expression in categories of the natural sciences and to measurement in values of physical magnitudes. To his taste, all the things in the physical world are given to observation by every man, and each of them is in the nature of the public domain of the recognition or of the possibility of recognition. On the other hand, there exists another world distinct in a cognitive logical manner from the physical world, a mental psychic world, as said in his words as follows. We recognize a world of things that are not located and do not occupy volume, and they have no chemical composition, and the occurrences in them are not given to expression in categories of physics or measurement in values of physical magnitudes. And they are recognized by direct recognition only to one man, who is their owner, and they are not given to direct recognition by any other creature. These things are my thoughts, my sensations, each of which is in the nature of the private domain of the consciousness. The third statement of this argument discusses the connection between the physical and the psychic world which were defined by him above. According to this statement, among others, there is no logical connection, obligated by logic, between our concepts referring to the things or to the events of the psychic reality, and between those referring to the things or to the events of the physical reality. And there is no logical prevention to raise an image of a world of consciousness without anything upon which a material description will apply. The fourth statement completes the argument in that, according to it, the psychic world of human beings is liable to influence the movements of their body, but not the movements of the bodies of other human beings, and events occurring in the bodies of human beings are liable to influence their sensations. This claim of the formal Leibowitz for the distinction between the physical world and the psychic world is refuted from its foundation, and so also his claim on the subject of the free will. But before I approach its refutation, I will note as a nutshell that regarding the analysis of the claimed connection between the two worlds, Leibowitz is required to the thought of the Rambam and of the founders of the Enlightenment, and not for nothing. This reference of his will teach us in the continuation on the direction needed for the distinction between the formal and the essential Leibowitz, a direction of walking backward for the sake of a faithful logical leap. For the sake of support in the physical world as it was defined by him, Leibowitz quotes specifically the Rambam and among others. Know that this reality in its entirety is one thing only. But on its face, and as itself, it is about a quote contradicting the claim for the distinction between body and soul. And this, without I am leaning on any quote as a reference non-given to rational contradiction, for such or another quote as itself, is not an exemplary proof for anything. The source of the error of Leibowitz is in the mixing between the separation of the body and the soul to the issue of the free will, as will be clarified in the continuation. On the other hand, specifically in the support for the absence of connection between the physical and the psychic world, Leibowitz is required to the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Whereas my psychic reality is not obligated by the existence of a physical world, and this is what both Descartes, both Spinoza, both Leibniz said, despite the abysmal contrasts between their systems. The emphasis is mine, AG. These quotes in these contexts are of great importance for the purpose of outlining the conclusions for the difference between the formal Leibowitz, the seemingly non-systematic, seemingly devoid of heritage, leaning on the errors of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, whose point of departure is entirely different from his, between the essential Leibowitz, the student of the Rambam. Here before us is the formal Leibowitz, denying in practice specifically his teacher and rabbi, the Rambam, whose faithful logical point of departure is the way in which the essential Leibowitz walks in a constant manner
and supports himself specifically in those whose conceptual point of departure is man and his thought.
Behold, thus before us is a formal contradiction in this essential subject, requiring an essential correction, requiring an exemplary correction. In practice, it is about a contradiction from within the foundational claim of Leibowitz for the distinction between the world of matter given to objective science, between the world of the soul and the free will, including the choice of the value,
and the faith given to man in a subjective manner, according to his erroneous formal system.
At the beginning of the analysis of this contradiction, I choose to open with an observation in the second statement of the psychophysical problem, according to Leibowitz. When we observe the beginning of the second statement, opening with the word we, there is revealed in its full strength and immediately the contradiction in his claim, and at the same time the immediate way for its refutation. For if before us is the private domain given to every man and to himself only, and it is learned, as Leibowitz himself claims, from his thoughts and recognition of himself only, then it is not possible to claim by definition for its application on the collective in the language of, we recognize a world of things, etc. What of it? If you claim that this recognition of a psychic reality is by the individual only, behold,
it is not possible to show that it is correct for the whole of man,
except for the claimant himself to himself. From the point of view of the individual claiming the distinction between his own physical and psychic reality, behold, when that individual observes the things external to him, for example, people claiming that they experience a physical and psychic world, he sees a physical world only. For according to the statement, he cannot see or truly perceive what is done within the thought of the other man. Thus, for example, when a man will come before him and claim that he has thoughts on a non-physical world, behold, from the perspective of the individual, that other man, and in practice, the whole of the human beings, act without any distinction between psychic and physical reality, except for himself.
The things are reflected both from the definition of the statement and from their proof as themselves. For when we observe all human beings, we see, and indeed see, a connection between their physical reality and their psychic reality. Until it will be proven otherwise, it seems that we will not be able to claim that the other man thinks about a non-physical reality without connection to his psychic reality. And more than that, we will be able to claim that the individual will not be able to think about a psychic reality, for example, when he is dead, and hence there is no difference of significance from the perspective of the individual's point of view, among the many between psychic and physical reality. But even more than that, from the point of view of all the others toward that individual who feels that there is a difference between his physical reality to his psychic reality, behold from their perspective as their private domain, toward that man feeling this in his private domain, there is no difference between his physical reality to his psychic reality. Meaning, every act of thought as itself, to be distinguished at this stage from its content, is given to proof as connected to the physical dimension in the relation between the whole of human beings to the individual, and the relation of the individual toward the whole of human beings. And except for the relation of the individual to himself, as an act connected to a physical dimension, meaning brain research, etc. From the perspective of the relation of the whole of human beings toward the individual, and the relation of the individual toward all the other human beings, we find ourselves learning that from the perspective of the individual, all the world is physical, except for himself. From the perspective of all the many, all of them, that individual is part of the physical world. Hence, in a logical manner, the probability is that the sensation of the individual toward himself is an illusion only, which is refuted toward him in the nature of its being physical, according to the recognition of all the world. Just as the illusion of the others, all of them, as far as it exists, is physical according to his own recognition. To what is the matter similar?
To a scientific proof. When man, from the perspective of his senses, feels a sensation which is opposite from the logical conclusion remaining after logical scientific thought.
That same sensory perception will not change, even though the logical conclusion refutes it. And behold, this is the science from its foundation.
Statements of the thought of man
On the physical world, which were created after thought, and not after sensory perception alone. When Leibowitz speaks about the psychic reality distinguished from the physical reality, he in practice speaks about a reality of sensory perception, seemingly internal, not on a reality of rational thought. Therefore, in a logical manner, the second and the third statements are refuted to the claim of Leibowitz entirely. Mine ou be. And it is doubtful if there is place to require to the fourth statement, although I will note that also it is refuted from its foundation. The logical probability teaches that that same sensation of the individual, according to which there is no connection between the physical world in the public domain to the psychic world in the private domain, is nothing more than an illusion. Therefore, the claim according to which we recognize a world of things in the private domain which are not given to physical definition is a claim refuted from its foundation from a logical perspective.
הפרחה אמונית-לוגית.
The logical refutation regarding the claim for the separation between body and soul places in an immediate problem the issue of the free will. This problem will be solved specifically in the faithful logical plane, as will be clarified in the continuation. But before the problem of the free will, I will require from a faithful logical perspective to the psychophysical problem as itself, as it was defined by Leibowitz, from the perspective of the very separation of the body and the soul, and this from a faithful rational point of departure. The claim for the distinction between a world without laws in the private domain to a world with laws in the public domain is refuted from its foundation, and even constitutes on its face in the nature of faithful heresy in the essence, ikar,
and an attempt for entry into a world which is not given to man by a faithful logical definition, as will be explained below. There is no any doubt that from a faithful logical perspective, and certainly according to the formal and the essential Leibowitz as one, God is not given to definition. In practice, all that is given to definition in approximation and forever not in a perfect manner is the world of the is. In contrast to this, the world which is beyond the is, which preceded the is, to the act of Genesis, is not given to any definition, and it belongs by definition to a reality which is outside of our understanding. In practice, every attempt for definition of what is not given to definition, which is the world beyond the world of the is, which is the one God including the is, and what is beyond the is, such as the attempts of the Kabbalah, is according to Leibowitz in a decisive manner heresy, anti-religiousness, anti-Judaism, idolatry. Therefore, when they claim that in the world of the is, including man, there exists a reality given to definition, which is the physical reality, and a reality different from the physical reality, which in practice is not given to definition from the perspective of his recognition, which is the psychic reality. Behold, there is in this seemingly in the nature of heresy in the essence, ikar. This is seemingly heresy in the essence, according to the formal Leibowitz himself, since this is a parallel in practice, by definition, between the world of God, which is not given to definition, including a reality which is necessarily not given to our understanding and to definition, between the world of the is, which we are part of, which is necessarily given to definition. The reality of the is one, according to the Rambam. This is a reality given by definition to definition, and it includes also the whole man with the entirety of his recognition in a faithful logical manner. In contrast to the is, God is necessarily one, and he includes the is and what is beyond the is. God is one, not given to definition. I am that I am.
It is possible that a different psychophysical issue is the issue of death to which Leibowitz was not ready to refer. The reason for this is because our own death is situated seemingly beyond our actual cognitive perception, this to be distinguished from our world of imagination, which we feel is not situated under the laws of physical reality, and after thought we understand that it is an illusion. Our personal death, by definition, is not given at all to our sensation, just as all that existed before our self-existence is not situated at all within the framework of our sensation, and even not within the framework of the capacity for our sensation. Meaning, the absence of our personal existence is situated beyond our physical perception capacity, and also beyond our recognition capacity.
Here there exists, seemingly, a psychophysical problem of a different type, since we assumed that only the undefined God is situated beyond our recognition and beyond the world of the is, which we are part of.
As such, it is possible that the true psychophysical problem is not the problem of our world of imagination, but the problem of death or the absence of our own existence before our existence. But I will leave this here in need of further study. The distinction between the physical and the psychic reality in man
fits perhaps those who thought that man and his thought are the center of the being,
and also those who think that it is possible to believe a faith of truth for its own sake by means of non-logical Kabbalah and not by means of logical thought with all its implications. Therefore, also from an inclusive faithful logical perspective, the psychophysical problem as itself regarding the difference between body and soul is refuted both from a logical perspective and from a faithful logical perspective. 2. A different matter is the issue of the absolute free will existing only and solely in a faithful logical manner, as will be clarified below.
על הרצון החופשי המוחלט והיחסי מנקודת מבט אמונית-לוגית.
The absolute free will, to be distinguished from the relative one, does not exist from a logical perspective, but only and solely from a faithful logical perspective, as will be clarified below. The refutation of the psychophysical problem whose basis is logical does not cancel the existence of the free will, as Leibowitz feared. On the contrary, it stands it on its correct basis, which is not logical, but faithful logical. Although I proved that from a logical and faithful logical perspective, there is no essential difference between the physical world to the mental world of man, as part of the world of the is, there still remains seemingly open the problem of the free will, or the freedom of the will, from a logical and faithful logical perspective. As I showed, in a preliminary manner, from a logical and faithful logical perspective, there exist moral and faithful logical facts according to which it is worthy to act. But we know that from an empirical perspective, most human beings do not act according to them. How much more so, behold, I showed that those reaching a high level of faithful logical understanding are obligated from the very definition of this understanding, as a walking in the paths of the truth, in partnership with the fellow creatures, and hence that they inherit from their material point of view, and in a reasonable manner, disappointment from the perspective of the inherent disagreement of those who did not reach this understanding, including to the fulfillment of its derivatives. Not only this, but we know in a preliminary manner that there exist faithful logical requirements for the individual, in the nature of the worthy for the fulfillment of the worship of God. But if everything is subject to facts, the question is asked, what is the true meaning of this requirement from the individual, with the reward and the punishment at its side.
If everything is given in advance and forced in an objective manner upon man. If everything is subject to laws, including the will, behold from a logical perspective, seemingly, there is no place for a requirement from man for the worship of God, because in this situation, that which was is that which shall be, and there is nothing new under the sun, from the perspective of man as part of the being of the is.
Furthermore, from a logical perspective that does not recognize God, there is no place for true morality really from those same reasons, a conclusion which Nietzsche reached in a material natural manner, on a distinct logical basis, and in which the formal Leibowitz supports, although seemingly from other reasons which were refuted here. But from that same reason from a logical perspective that does not recognize God, there is no place seemingly for the requirement of the judgments, the commandments and the laws, and also not for the existence of the reward and the punishment.
For man will do that which he would do anyway.
When Leibowitz and also the Rambam are caught in distress regarding the matter of the free will, behold, the first Leibowitz, to be distinguished from his predecessor, tries to escape from it in the logical plane only, and fails a resounding failure seemingly, for example, in the psychophysical problem. In contrast to him, the Rambam struggles with the issue from a faithful logical point of view, although he does not provide a satisfactory explanation for his conclusion regarding the existence of the free will. According to the words of the Rambam, the human free will, which is in relation to something, to be distinguished from the will of God, exists because this is the foundation of the faith and the foundation of the worship of God, as said in the Torah. On its face, it can be seen that from a rational perspective, this is an unconvincing argument, since there is not in it any dimension of an exemplary proof, and therefore it can be perceived as the taste of the claimant, who with all due respect constitutes his taste, which is from an essential perspective his taste only. And indeed, the solution to the issue of the free will is situated specifically in the faithful logical plane, and not in the logical plane, which is supreme over it, similar to the position of the Rambam, which must be developed into an exemplary faithful logical explanation to the law regarding the existence of the free will. From a logical perspective, the human will, as part of the is subject to the being of the is, whereas the is subject to the laws of the being of the is.
Hence the free will is relative from the perspective of man,
as the relation of the grain to the universe, but does not exist in an essential principled manner from the perspective of his logical perception of the being of the is, since it is subject to the laws of the being of the is. In contrast to this, from a faithful logical perspective, the will in its free manifestation is subject to the inclusive being of God, as will be clarified below. Necessarily and by definition a free will to be distinguished from the being of the is devoid of God. The will in its free essence, to be distinguished from the logical free will in its relative essence,
belongs to the basis of the relation of man to the undefined God,
and in practice to the basis of the relation of the matter to God, or more correctly, to the basis of the relation of God to the matter, as will be clarified below. The absolute free will is situated by definition only and solely in the undefined being of God. This matter is learned, since were there no freedom of choice in the being of God, behold, he is subject to law, and as such to definition. And behold, this thing is not possible from the very non-definition and non-materialization of God.
When we claim that there is, for man, a free will,
we mean by it that there is for him a possibility of choice within the framework of a material world, between material options. I can choose between my worship of God, between my non-worship of God, but I cannot choose between options that are not given in my hand from a material logical perspective. Thus, I cannot choose between an action situated in the world of the is, between an action situated in the world beyond the is. I can choose only and solely between actions in the world of the is, and this from my very definition as part of the world of the is. The certain point of encounter from a faithful logical perspective between the absolute free will and the matter
is not situated therefore in man or in the matter as itself,
but in the encounter between the matter between the undefined and the non-physical God. From here, it results that the certain point of encounter to our knowledge from a faithful logical perspective between the matter to the undefined is situated in the act of Genesis, which as itself is not given to understanding, since it involves the matter and the undefined God together. From the moment of the act of Genesis, the matter in a long-term logical manner aspires to return to that same primordial moment. The universe expands, and from its very definition as matter, which is limited, it is at the same time also converging. But while the matter acts in a mechanical manner for convergence to the material starting point of the matter,
Behold man as the peak of the matter,
who is to be distinguished from it by possessing consciousness, strives also for that which preceded the material starting point,
man strives to reach that which he will never reach by definition,
to the recognition of God, to the recognition of the entire being.
Man, who is the known peak of the matter,
Strives therefore from his very ultimate purpose as part of the world of the is who possesses consciousness, to reach God, a matter which is not attained by definition, for God is not defined by definition, and is not given to materialization.
This ultimate purpose of man as the peak of the world of the is the worship of God, meaning
The constant struggle between the walking after the matter as itself to the matter, the bottom of the ladder, between the climbing toward the undefined, which is opposed by definition to the material being, which is between matter to matter.
In other words, the ultimate purpose of man is to cancel the relativity of his free will,
and to reach the absolute free will, which is entirely detached from subordination to matter, and from which everything began.
the freedom of the will from the perspective of man,
Moves therefore from an edge of relative freedom toward an edge of absolute freedom, which is undefined and unknown and is never attained. Hence, only the faith for its own sake embodies the free will in its supreme essence, which as itself exists,
although unattainable and undefined to man.
This is not the will to power characterizing the peak of the relative will at the bottom of the ladder. It is the will to reach the absolute free will, which is detached from the chains of the matter, which comes to a supreme expression in the act of the faith for its own sake. From this faithful logical explanation for the free will, there arises and ascends an additional important insight, closing the issue of the free will from a faithful logical perspective.
The worship of God, or the status of man before God,
or the aspiration to reach the absolute free will, detached from the chains of the matter, as a relation between him and God whose source is in himself, in thought and in deed, or, as the words of Leibowitz, the relation between God and me I do not know. I know the relation between me and God embodied in the worship of God, and more precisely, in the effort for the worship of God. Such is the parable of the refraining from lighting a cigarette on Shabbat, etc., which is a deed opposed, seemingly, to the material will to smoke at any time that I feel a need for it. But this claim contradicts the basis of the system of Leibowitz,
which is not humanistic, and its point of departure is not man, but God.
And as I clarified, its possible basis is not the logical domain, but specifically the faithful logical one. When I worship God out of faith for its own sake, I create, according to Leibowitz, a connection with God.
And we have no concept regarding the connection between God to man.
But the fate of this thought-sensory intuitive claim, like every claim striving for truth, is to be examined by means of thought and refutation, and in our matter, a faithful logical refutation. After thought and a faithful logical refutation, I reach specifically a different and perhaps surprising insight according to which, by means of the worship of God done for its own sake,
God creates a connection with man, and not the opposite.
The faithful logical reason for this is because the ultimate purpose to reach the undefined is rooted necessarily and by definition in the absolute free will of the undefined toward the matter at the moment of Genesis. The matter aspires to return to the act of Genesis, and this aspiration is rooted in the act of Genesis, whose source is necessarily in absolute free will, which is not subject to the laws of the matter at all.
The matter aspires to return to the act of Genesis, and this aspiration is rooted in the act of Genesis, whose source is necessarily in absolute free will, which is not subject to the laws of the matter at all, which is the only matter that we can understand from the basic relation of the undefined God to the matter whose peak is man.
Therefore, every action whose matter is from the perspective of the faithful logical man in the reaching to the undefined God and to the absolute free will which will never be attained, is necessarily the action of God toward the matter and not the action of the matter toward God, because its foundation is in the primordial absolute free will of the undefined toward the defined.
Not only this, but from a faithful logical perspective, man cannot initiate a connection with God,
since his will is free in a relative manner only. The initiative for the creation of such a connection can be only and solely by the absolute free will, meaning from the undefined to the defined,
and it comes from the perspective of man to expression in the worship of God done for its own sake.
This matter corresponds to the faithful logical law reflected from the analysis of that which is said in the Torah, as will be clarified also in the continuation, and according to which to the act of prophecy precedes a discourse that God initiates with the prophet.
Or, in other words, the action of God toward man comes in its peak to faithful logical expression in the thought preceding the faithful logical deed.
This matter corresponds also to the view of the private and general providence, hashgacha, of the Rambam, according to which as much as a man ascends in the degree of prophecy, then the divine providence toward him intensifies, and vice versa. And beyond that, there is no private providence in the world.
As much as man ascends in the degrees of the worship of God for its own sake,
behold, from his perspective, he approaches the absolute free will, which will never be attained by him. At the same time, from the perspective of the trail of the undefined by definition,
man ascends in the degree of the connection that God creates with him,
whose foundation is necessarily in absolute free will. A question that can be asked is whether it is not about a circular argument, assuming the requested, and even bringing us to the point of absurdity. For the argument of the act of Genesis raises that all the creation is a divine act. Hence, every relation of matter to matter is a divine act, whose foundation is in absolute free will, from the very definition of the undefined and non-physical God. And if so, the matter, then every action between matter to matter, and even between silent matter to silent matter, is an action of absolute free will. And behold, this is an absurdity. To this I answer that our concern here is in the connection between the matter to God, and not in the connection between matter to matter. Regarding all that concerns the connection between matter to matter, behold, there is not in this any free will, for otherwise we involve the physical in the non-physical. But regarding all that concerns the connection between matter possessing consciousness to that which is beyond the matter, or in other words, to the true worship of God, to the climbing on the ladder for its own sake, including the science and the morality and the faith together, behold, this necessitates necessarily and by definition absolute free will,
whose source and deep direction is from God to man,
and not the opposite. Any other basis of connection between the matter and between the undefined and non-physical God is not possible by definition. The worship of God is necessarily involved in absolute free will. Behold, thus I proved that from a faithful logical perspective,
from the perspective of that which is known to us about the connection with God and the approaching to Him from the perspective of man. Regarding the very definition of the free will as itself, behold, it belongs from its very nature to the very essence and definition of the relation between man to God, to be distinguished from the definition of its content and from the means creating it meaning. Man, body and soul as one, and there is nothing new under the sun. In other words, man and his will as themselves are part of the being of the is, but the freedom of the will is a faithful logical factual part of the relation between the God, who is not defined to man as part of an is, and cannot be as itself defined, by definition.
This is part of the essence of the relation between the undefined God to the matter at its peak. This is the basis of the worship of God, the basis of the connection with God, to be distinguished from the essence of the matter toward the matter, in a world of matter which is not truly free. This essence is not defined and cannot be defined and understood from its very essence,
but not because of its belonging to the world of the is, but specifically because of its belonging to the undefined God and its undefined revelation in his trail. To summarize this not simple matter which occupied and will yet occupy many and good people, I will add and note that the worship of God, meaning the striving for the highest closeness to God, is the ultimate purpose of the faithful logical man. It is the faith for its own sake. Necessarily, there is involved in it sacrifice from a material perspective, from the perspective of his material nature, from the perspective of the relative free will of man. This sacrifice is at the freedom of the human relative will in its highest virtue, the distancing from the bottom of the ladder and the infinite approaching to its upper edge. The peak of the worship of God, meaning the prophecy, is a faithful logical peak of an effort of the first degree to attain that which is known in advance that will not be attained, while recognizing severe material, personal, social meanings necessarily derived from this effort, and all this out of a faithful logical faith for its own sake. This is the aspiration to attain that which is known in advance that will not be attained, and this in an inverse relation to the needs of the matter, an aspiration which necessitates, by definition, the existence of an unattainable absolute free will, and an aspiration toward it which will never be realized. This is the aspiration toward a supreme will acting against the material will in a world of matter which is at its peak the will to power. As much as the closeness to the palace increases, so the distancing from the foot of the ladder increases and increases. As much as the distancing from the foot of the ladder increases, so the effort to ascend and even to remain in place becomes increasingly difficult against the gravitational force of the matter, of the material society, and especially of the personal material impulse, Yetzer. The will acting in the worship of God according to the paths of the truth is the basis of the relation between the matter and between the undefined, whose necessary faithful logical source is in the act of Genesis. This is by definition the absolute free will with the, according to the essential Leibowitz, which from the perspective of man is forever unattainable and undefined, and from the perspective of the trail of God is forever absolute. This is man situated in the highest possible degree of freedom, distancing himself from his limited material chains. Man thinking at his peak, reaching new old peaks in the scientific, the moral, and the faithful thought together, and this out of his faithful logical decision, regarding the conceptual practical realization of his faithful logical ultimate purpose, the worship of God.